Well, welcome everybody to our evening service, this 6 o'clock service. Great to have you with us. And if you've already joined us today, welcome back. And we really pray that you're going to be blessed through this service this evening, both with the word and with the sung worship, and that the Lord draws close to you. And you leave this time really set up for the week ahead. So let's start our service this evening by worshiping the Lord in song together.
There's a tremor in the earth, in the ground beneath my feet. There's a miracle at work in the things I can't yet see. I believe it, and there's a tremor in my soul. There's a whisper in the deep of the promise I can hold, of the future calling me. I believe it. It's you, your word, your power on the move. Sweep through this earth as only you can do. How can I stay the same? You're setting the stage for amazing things. The future is safe, count me in. There's a turning of the tide as you shift the atmosphere. And there's a whole new lease of life, just as sure as you are near. Yes, I believe it. It's you, your word, your power on the move. Sweep through this earth as only you can do. How can I stay the same? You're setting the stage for amazing things. The future is safe, count me in. Just count me in, Lord. And now is the time. Lord, come and rend the heavens. Reveal a greater measure in this place. Open our eyes. Your glory at the center of it all. I believe it. That now is the time. Lord, come and rend the heavens. Reveal a greater measure in this place. Open our eyes. Your glory at the center of it all. Oh, I believe it now. Now is the time. Lord, come and rend the heavens. Reveal a greater measure in this place. Oh, and open our eyes. Oh, your glory at the center of it all. Hey, I believe it. It's you, your word, your power on the move. Lord, sweep through this earth as only you can do. And how can I stay the same? You're setting the stage for amazing things. The future is safe, count me in. Oh, I believe the future is safe, so count me in. You're not finished yet. You're not finished yet, Lord. The future is safe, count me in.
Okay, well, let's just look at a few verses from Genesis chapter 12 together as we get into the word this evening. This is Genesis 12 and verses 1 to 3. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Well, you might remember from last week that we were looking at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, where it all came from, the seed bed, really, of the Bible. All the major themes of the Bible are introduced in those 11 chapters. And there were 5 themes, if you remember: creation, relationship, human sinfulness, covenant, and salvation. And we're going to look this evening at the theme of covenant in more detail. Now, I was saying that the universal problem of humankind going their own way and turning their back on a relationship with God was going to be answered by a specific solution. And God homes in on one man, Abraham, who later became known as Abraham. That's recorded in chapter 17, verse 3, as a sign of the covenant that God was making with him. Now, we were looking last week also at the repeated use of the Hebrew word toldot. It's a Hebrew word that's translated as "this is the account of," but really meaning this is what comes next. As the result of where we've got to, this is what comes next, toldot. So the end of chapter 11 is the account, we find the account of the Tower of Babel, where humankind attempts to save themselves by means of their own technology. Babel literally means gateway to God, Bab-El, gateway to God. And the Tower of Babel, known locally as a ziggurat, was constructed with steps that wound around the outside in an upward spiral, literally a stairway to heaven. Well, the reason for this tower, this focal point of getting to heaven, was that they were saying, we don't want to be scattered. We want to be in community. So we're going to define for ourselves what community looks like, and we're going to trust in our own technological brilliance, and we're going to build this tower as a monument to that. Well, of course, they ended up being scattered. The very thing that they fear the most is what God causes to happen. And God brings about a confusion of languages. So, what happens next? After this complete breakdown in community between people and between them and God, where do we go from there? Well, in chapter 11, verse 27, there's another toldot. This is the history of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram. And God focuses in on one person, Abram, to be the particular solution to the universal problem. Now, that particular solution is destined to become universal in scope as Abraham becomes the father of the Israelite nation, and on from that, the father of many nations. So here we come to the second part of what is called the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, and we get to Genesis chapter 12 through to the end of Deuteronomy. Now, we can look at that, Genesis 12 to the end of Deuteronomy, in a couple of ways. We could take the chronological approach to it to understand it. So Genesis 12 to Exodus 24 is where God shows, it shows God's chosen people from Abraham through to the Exodus. And then Exodus 25 to the end of Deuteronomy, that focuses on God's people from the Exodus through to their entry into the promised land. But we can also look at this through a theological approach. So Genesis 12 to Exodus 24 is the establishment of the covenant relationship. And covenant is one of the major subjects in the whole Bible. When covenant is focused upon in the Bible, it often has sacrifice attached to it, and law attached to it, and a covenant sign attached to it. So Exodus 25 to the end of Deuteronomy, then, it's all about what it means to live within the covenant. Covenant is a very important theme in the Bible. What is a covenant? Essentially, it's a binding agreement imposed by God that makes possible a relationship with human beings. It's not negotiated, it's not renegotiable, it's not up for discussion. You know, it's not like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments written in stone and saying to the people, well, look, the good news is I managed to talk him down from 100 commandments to just these 10. So, no, covenant is God's initiative, and he invites us into a relationship by means of us abiding by the covenant rules. But like we saw last week, at the heart of it all is the amazing grace of God. God's grace reached out to and found Noah, and Noah was blameless as a result. God's grace found Abraham, and he was considered righteous as a result. Just like when God's amazing grace finds us through his Son, Jesus, we are considered to be clean and righteous in his sight. He doesn't find us because we are clean and right, and he's seeking out those who are already worthy. No, he finds us, and his grace makes us clean and right. It's all about grace. It's at the heart of God. It's what he uses to reach out to us and enter into a relationship with us. And the way he enters into a relationship with us is via covenant. Now, there are 4 important aspects to covenant that God made with Abraham. Well, to be precise, a covenant is not made, it's cut. Why? Because the covenant that God gave to Moses at Mount Sinai was cut into the rock by the finger of God. And so covenants are cut. Well, the first important element of covenants is that Abraham's descendants will become a great nation. That's what God says to Abraham, or Abraham in Genesis 12, verse 2. I will cause you to become the father of a great nation. That's what the name Abraham really means. The second thing is that nation will possess the promised land. Going on to verse 7 of chapter 12. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, I'm going to give this land to your offspring. And Abraham built an altar there to commemorate the Lord's visit. The third thing is that they will be God's own people. I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee to make you into a mighty nation, says chapter 17, verse 2. And God then widens the scope of the covenant even further by promising that through them, those who are not Abraham's descendants will be blessed. Chapter 12, verse 3, all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Now, why am I focusing on covenant this evening? Because covenant is how God has always related to people. It's how he related to Abraham, and it's how he relates to us today. Now, the promises that came with covenant, particularly the promise of blessing, Abraham had to receive by faith. And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord declared him righteous because of his faith. Just like Noah before him had to receive the covenant promises by faith, so did Abraham. And in fact, Abraham's life is the story of him living by faith in a promise. He had no sign of receiving it in his lifetime. At the time of his death, he had no land. There was no great nation. He only had 2 sons. He was living in the tension of what God said he would do, but that he had not yet received. And in fact, Hebrews 11, verses 8 and 9 says, it was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going, and even when he reached the land that God promised him, he lived there by faith. For he was like a foreigner living in a tent. The outworking of covenant is always received by faith, just as it is for Christians today. We've got to receive it by faith. Why doesn't God just give us an absolute sign? Why doesn't he reveal himself and prove it beyond all doubt? Because covenant is always received by faith. We still live in the tension of being made promises that we have not yet seen fulfilled. Any theology that says you can have it all now is misleading. It's not true. Just like for Abraham, we live today on the basis of the promises of God. Well, the covenant that God cut has 2 focuses. The focus on the individual person in Genesis, and the focus on the nation in Exodus. In Genesis, God focuses on one person, Abraham, who became Abraham, and says, I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee to make you into a mighty nation. And in Genesis 15, the covenant is seen to be on the basis of sacrifice. Abraham's directed by God to get 2 heifers and sacrifice them and divide them into 2, and after which the Lord passed between the carcasses. That sounds weird, but actually it was a prophetic act by God. It was God saying, may I be torn in 2 if I break the promise that I'm making. And the sequel to this sacrifice is in Genesis 17, where God gives instructions to Abraham in chapter 17, verse 1, which is actually a statement of the law. So you've got sacrifice and you've got law. In other words, God says to Abraham, and indeed to everyone that he offers a relationship to, which includes us, if you want to live in covenant with me, you must walk in obedience. Now, with Noah, the sign of the covenant was a rainbow in the sky. Now, we saw that last week. With Abraham, the sign is something that he himself had to impose, the sign of circumcision. You see that in chapter 17, verses 9 and 10. So in the book of Genesis, God's focus is very much on the individual with whom he cuts a covenant. But the book of Exodus, in that book, the focus shifts to the nation. Yes, God deals with one man, Moses, but that's on behalf of the nation. So rather than calling one man to make a sacrifice as the covenant is cut, God calls the whole nation to make a sacrifice. So whilst the Hebrews are still in captivity in Egypt, and with the arrival of the 10th plague, announced to the whole community that on the 10th day of this month, each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice. Exodus 12, verse 3. Just think about this for a moment. The fact is that the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn of each family, would have struck the Israelites had they not been obedient to the instructions of God to paint the blood of the sacrificial lamb on the doorposts of their houses. They had to act in faith. And this is the thing about covenant. We have to act obediently in faith. So to be delivered, there had to be a sacrifice. But if you look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 13, it says, "The blood you have smeared on your doorposts will serve as a sign." Now, the literal translation from the Hebrew of that is that the blood will be a sign of you, or a token of you. Why is that important? Well, it wasn't the case that the angel of death saw the blood of a lamb on the doorpost and translated that as, oh, the people inside the house are exempt from the firstborn being killed, and moving on. The angel of death saw the blood on the doorpost and said, oh, the firstborn in this house has already been killed. The blood is a sign of that. That's why verse 4 says that if the family is too small, then they're to share the lamb with their neighbors. You see, there's an exact relationship between the lamb and the people, the amount of the lamb and the people. The substitution had to be just enough. And this is where we get the idea of Christ being our substitute on the cross. God looks at that and says, in effect, the wages of sin is death. They died. They are on the cross. Now you look at chapter 12, verse 30, and it says something very interesting. It says, there was not a single house where someone had not died. How can it be, if the angel of death passed over all the Israelite houses, sparing the firstborn? How can that be? If that's the case, which is kind of the point of Passover, how come there was not a single house where someone had not died? See, that verse isn't saying there was not a single Egyptian house. It includes all the houses in Egypt. So what does that mean? Well, the angel of death saw the blood painted on the doorposts of the Israelite houses and counted it as a sign of the firstborn inside. The lamb died as a substitute for that firstborn child. And that is how it can be reckoned in chapter 12, verse 30, that there was not a single house where someone hadn't died. Either the actual firstborn or the substitute. So, covenant requires sacrifice and law. And so when Moses led the people out of Egypt, he headed for Mount Sinai. And chapters 13 to 20 recount the adventures that went on to get to Mount Sinai. And that was a journey that took 3 months to get there. Now, chapter 20 is the account of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, which is, in effect, the betrothal contract that the Lord gave the people, signaling his binding intention that he will be their God and they will be his people in a marriage relationship. Fast forward to the book of Revelation, and you can see the bridegroom coming for his bride and the bride of Christ being spotless. The whole relationship between God and his people being painted in a marriage setting. And so the betrothal contract, in Hebrew, the ketubah, that is drawn up between two people as they get betrothed, that's all reflected in the Ten Commandments. This is covenant. But of course, as Christians, we know that the old covenant was not capable of saving people because it was dependent on the people being able to stay faithful to the terms of the covenant. There needed to be a new covenant made with the people, a covenant which does not depend on people's ability to maintain the terms of the contract. A new covenant dependent on something that will never change was needed. A new covenant that depended on the sacrifice of God's Son, Jesus Christ. But for now, back in Exodus, we have the covenant that is cut between God and the people, with Moses as the mediator. The Israelites were called to remember that sacrifice was at the heart of covenant by sacrificing a lamb each year. Announce to the whole community that on the 10th day of this month, each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice. Sacrifice and law, the two ways that sinful people can live in fellowship with a holy God. And so we come to the book of Leviticus. And this is the religious basis for having fellowship with God. And then, for a second, skipping over Numbers, we come to the last book in the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy, which literally means the second law, or the restatement of the law. This time from the point of view of the moral basis for having fellowship with God. And the link between these two, the religious and the moral approaches to relating to God, is the book of Numbers. That's why Numbers is placed between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, bringing both the religious and the moral bases for living in relationship with God together. The book of Numbers shows that the real basis for that fellowship is the faithfulness of God himself. Every time the people of Israel faced overwhelming opposition, God was there providing them with victory. And the point of all of this is that he is still a faithful, covenant-keeping God today. Praise God, he keeps his covenants. And the ultimate covenant with the ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of his Son on the cross. And the significance of all of this is that we don't get to set the rules. We don't get to define the boundaries of the relationship with him. He is God and we are not. He cuts the covenant with us. We are called as his children to be obedient to his covenant. What is it that is better than sacrifice? To obey. Those who are in that covenant relationship have a desire to obey God. To obey is better than sacrifice. He is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God who keeps his promises. And because of that, the people under the leadership of Joshua finally entered the promised land, as we'll see next week. But for now, let's turn to worship of the God who can absolutely be trusted to keep his covenant promises to you, to me, to all his people. He keeps every one of his promises. It's in his nature. He's a covenant-making, promise-keeping God. So let's pray together. And let's just thank him right now. Lord, I thank you that you are not a God who changes his mind. There are no shifting shadows in you. Thank you that the relationship that you draw us into through covenant is a relationship that we can absolutely depend on and rely on. Lord, I thank you that you seal this covenant with the blood of your own Son, Jesus. Thank you that it's something that we receive by faith and then are called in the power of the Spirit to live out in our lives. I thank you that we are serving an utterly reliable, utterly dependable, covenant-keeping, promise-making God. And I thank you for the covenant that you have cut with us through your Son, Jesus. He is our substitute. It's his blood. It's his body. It's through faith in him, by grace, that we are saved. Just thank you and bless you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free. Oh, it's free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free. Oh, it's free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free. Oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Oh, I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Yes, I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. God, you are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Yes, I am who you say I am. I am who you say I am.
Thank you so much for being with us this evening as we take that second look at understanding our Bibles. And I hope and I pray that your confidence in him is growing, that you don't somehow have to convince him to go on loving you. You don't somehow have to be the person that deserves the reward of his love towards you. He reached out to you and me in grace. And it's his grace that makes us clean and makes us worthy and makes us right in his sight. And as we go through this week, and there are opportunities to extend that grace to other people, will you take those opportunities? And will you just take the opportunity this week to thank him that he is your covenant-keeping, promise-keeping, loving Heavenly Father? And I hope and I pray that you have a great week. Have a blessed week. Have a week where you know the closeness of the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ in your life. And then we look forward to getting together again next Sunday evening. So God bless you and have a great week.
Stepping out of the boat into waters unknown. Every step filled with faith, Lord, I'm holding you close. I will walk on the waves with my eyes fixed on you. It will be so. So come shake this place, Lord, have your way. Your will be done, Lord, have your way. With you, I can move mountains with you. Yes, the dead will arise, yes, you give the word, and it will be so. This is I believe, then we are yet to see miracles greater than these. With you, it will be so. In this place, as I wait for the wonders to come, it will not take away what you've already done. There's no power to stop all that you have been.